Rabbi Eli, Whoopi Goldberg. What else is there to talk about in the world that's being set on fire? The most important thing right now is a woman on a daily talk show host who said a slip of the tongue about the Jewish people during the Holocaust.
Well, it's an award-winning, Oscar-winning actress with a significant amount of pull and influence, and I think that's why there's been so much gravitas and magnetism to what she said, and that sparked this whole debate of was she wrong and where was she even coming from in the first place?
Okay, so just to get a big picture here, what did she say?
As far as I understood, the context of the discussion was a book called Mouse, which is a cartoon meant to depict the Holocaust for secondary or high school kids.
I have read.
And it's been banned.
It's a comic novel,
reasons.
A graphic novel.
Very graphic. That's why it was banned, because of scenes of graphic violence and nudity. And the talk show went into a debate of should it have been banned or not. And at one point, Whoopi Goldberg said, we're basically sidestepping the real issue here, which is that the Holocaust had nothing to do with race. And it was all about the inhumanity of man against man. And she said, and I quote, it was two white groups. And that set off the whole panel, and it didn't go down very well at the time, and then the backlash since then has been quite volcanic.
Okay, so from what I've seen in social media, a lot of people have gotten caught up in the question of, was it about race? Was it not about race? And it seems to be quite clear that the Nazi ideology was one about racial superiority and inferiority, and the attempt to create the perfect pure race. And the Jewish people were clearly not part of that plan, right? So, okay, I'm going to ask a pretty straightforward question to you.
It's become an interview now. Okay.
Well, I've got my own opinions too, but I just love hearing yours.
Thank you.
My question is this. Okay, does it matter? Does it matter that she was wrong? What I mean is the following. Is the question and the confusion and the controversy really about whether the Holocaust was about race or not? Me, as I a Jew in the 21st century, does it matter to me? Do I need to know whether the Nazis killed me because I was Jewish or because I was religious or because I was a ethnic minority or a racial minority? Like, who cares why they killed us?
That's a great question. I think it's important after that to backtrack a step and actually pose the question of was she even wrong? But first, let's deal with your question is premised on, let's say, a statement that what she said was factually incorrect and inauthentic, and that's why she's got into such deep water as a result. The question is, why does it matter? Let's say she was wrong, and the Holocaust, by Hitler's own admission, was about race. He described his caricature of the Jewish people was, as you said, as an inferior race. So does it matter that she was wrong? My first instinct when I heard her description was I focused on the alternative proposition, which was it's not about race, it's about the inhumanity of one group of men or humans to another group. And when I heard that, I thought, how do you solve that? If that's the root of the issue.
Oh, well, you don't solve that. That's
it doesn't have a solution.
Problem,
it doesn't,
right?
Correct. That's what struck me, is you're basically saying that humanity is eternally damned, and she almost said this, to just be nasty to each other. And the solution is be nice, which is intangible, impractical, and you can't pass policy to tell people to just be nice to one another. Whereas if we frame the Holocaust in terms of being racially motivated, that is something that through education and through generational shifts, you can start solving. So that was what bothered me most about the wrongness of her approach.
Right. So you're saying here that if we do accept that it was racially motivated, then there's a cure, because we could simply tell people, no, silly. It's not just
simple.
about race. But then again, we open up another can of worms because, what if the Nazis were right? Not about the inferiority part, but about the race part. What if the Jewish people are a race? So then are you going to say, well, if it is about racism, is it just a question of education? My response to that would be, first of all, I think you alluded to the complication of the fact of are we a race or not, right? It's been a age-old debate. Do you classify Jews as a race, as a religion, as a nation or a people? And really, I don't know if we want to talk about the details of the specifics, but there's a lot of blurring of lines there, right? On the one hand, you could be born Jewish. On another hand, you could convert in. And so it's really very difficult to box the Jewish people into just race or just religion. But I would suggest that...
If I can ask, what's your gut feeling? Because
are we a race or a religion?
I was thinking about this before. I think it's a global problem in the sense that the terminology and the definitions of race and ethnicity and culture and religion, they're changing the whole time. And another thing that bothered me is, whereas it's true that Hitler referred to the Jewish people as a race, the global definition of race and racism in the 1920s and 30s, when he wrote and published Mein Kampf, was so radically different to what it is now 100 years later, in the sense that back then the only definition was, I'm not going to quote verbatim, but shared physical or psychological characteristics that a group of people has that is distinct to another group of people. And that served his purposes very well, in the sense that for him, his racism, call it that, his hatred burnt so strongly that he wanted to engineer a situation where you couldn't convert out of Judaism. You couldn't drop the religion and save yourself from the gas chambers. There was something physically and psychologically deficient in you as a Jew that had to be eradicated from the world.
Right.
So it served his purposes to use the 1920s definition of race to justify the ethnic cleansing that he was putting forward.
Well, surely today, even by that definition gets us nowhere when we talk about human beings. I mean, simply just as a useful category or not. Take the Jewish people as a good example. There are so many different types physically of Jewish people.
Yes.
Skin color, everything, you name it. Like, depending on where they came from in the world, it's no longer a useful category to use physiological traits to be able to describe a race. I would say,
by the way, scientists can't agree. I mean, I was reading earlier this week, there is a range of, it ranges from 3 to 60 scientific definitions of distinct human races. There's no consensus. A, how to define the word race, and B, how to apply it in the real world.
Yeah. So for me, I kind of skip past this because I personally don't know if it's even relevant whether we are a race or not. What I saw directly as the most invasive or the most damaging or threatening part of Whoopi Goldberg's statements was twofold. Number one, I think she ignored the fact that it doesn't really matter why people hate us. In other words, it really matters. It was
just inhumanity.
Well, no.
It was a group of evil, crazy people, and it could happen again.
No, but what I mean is that...
And there's no way of knowing.
Let me rephrase that. It doesn't matter if we're a race or not. It only matters what's the intention of the person who's committing the act of hate. Yet Jewish people have been hated for a lot of reasons.
Yes.
You want to call us a race and then hate us for that? Great. That's, I guess, called racism. If you want to call us a religion and hate us because of our religion, you want to call us a socioeconomic group of people within society and say, you have too much money and you have too much privilege and you take up all the good spots in the universities or whatever it is that people want to say. I think that that's what's more important. And to deny the fact that it wasn't about racism means you're not allowed to use that term, which is so loaded. And if I hurl the word racist at an individual, I'm basically calling you the worst person alive. You as a white person aren't allowed to claim that as a status of an oppressed person.
So you're reading that as well. As I was going to ask you, there's really another thing that struck me in when she then reframed and recoined her understanding of the Holocaust, which was, and this was a direct quote, she said it was two groups of white people.
Right.
It puzzled me why she brought that into the conversation at all and why it was relevant. But what you've said also got me thinking of, is she shunting race out of the door? But you seem to be arguing that, okay, there's been multiple reasons in history that we've been hated anyway. Yeah. Is it true that Hitler's anti-Semitism, I believe this to an extent, that his anti-Semitism was new? And it was precisely because he founded it on a racial argument that it was so dangerous. And that had never been done before, in the sense that, as far as my understanding of history goes, anti-Semitism historically tended to be anchored in sentiments against religion or culture. not against race.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we'll have to bring in our guest speaker, the sociologist. No, I'm joking. I think you and I have to figure this out ourselves. But from what I understand, I mean, think about the Slavic people. That just means they were an entire race of what a certain group of people at that time considered to be a people who are basically born into a slave culture, like they were meant to be slaves from birth. And we certainly see that in ancient Greek ideology, that there is a group of people who are always meant to be slaves. So I do think that there is something, call it physical, call it racial, about targeting people for a certain group. I think that, first of all, what's most pertinent about the issue being raised is, what is the attack being used at the time that's the most potent attack that we can apply? So back then, it was about physical characteristics,
Yes.
right? Today, race might mean something else.
I think it almost certainly does.
It probably does mean
back
something
then,
else.
the sociology and the science of the time was very into eugenics. It was very into post-Nietzsche and the idea of this superior and inferior race. It was very much based on, if I can say it and be a little bit more left-wing, it was very much couched in European imperialism, which was still justifying its own existence by saying, okay, there's a race of people here and there's a race down there. So as I keep saying, it served the purposes of the 20s and 30s, building up to the Second World War. Nowadays, you go to any distinguished dictionary, you will find a different definition of race, and then it blurs into ethnicity at some point, and that blurs into culture. Maybe it's just the case that Whoopi Goldberg wasn't wrong. It's just semantics. She just got her terminologies wrong.
Right, so it seems like what she did was she took today's definition of race and placed it onto
Correct.
the 1930s and the 1940s.
Yeah.
But what, again...
And that's where it broke down. And didn't make sense to her in 2022.
But it just shows such a blind spot of where people are at today. Is today we say, let's narrow the category of race so that you can't actually be accused of racism if you're attacking or hurting a certain group of people. Whether or not we identify as a race, that's also a very pernicious way of looking at the world. Because what you're essentially saying is that if you don't have certain types of characteristics, you actually don't qualify for being as oppressed as somebody else who has a different type of characteristics. That's what I found to be very frightening, is that, I guess I don't qualify for racism anymore.
To be the victim of racism.
That's right. And the way in which people use racism today, that's basically like saying that any attack done on you and your people is second rate in terms of how scary and how dangerous and how awful and evil it might be. Because racism, that's the worst in the hierarchy of evil.
That's the gold standard of evil.
That's right.
And you can get the racist medal. That's what puzzles me, is who awards that medal. As in, historically, we'd like to think the victim sets the terms and conditions. The victim describes their victimhood and their suffering, and they will claim that victimhood in a valid way. Is it the case that we're seeing in recent years, and I know this is a debate that's been going on for years now, about anti-Semitism specifically, that has the ability to define ourselves as victims in any sort of way been taken away from us and handed over almost to people who are not Jewish and haven't had a Jewish experience or heritage? Is that the same with other ethnic minorities? There I go again, ethnicity, who knows what it really is, but is this something that's shifting in recent years?
Yeah, I don't know. The whole conversation bothers me because I have kind of a visceral opposition to trying to claim victimhood status. In other words, I'm conflicted as a Jew, right? On the one hand, I recognize the scary reality that, in the United States, more than half of the religious hate crimes are directed at Jews. Now, again, they're categorizing hate crimes to Jews as religious as opposed to ethnic or racial. So that's another categorization. But whatever it might be, anti-Semitic hate crimes are very much on the rise in many Western countries. But on the other hand, I don't want to perpetually seek to elevate myself as a victim. So where is the balance there? In today's 21st century, Whoopi Goldberg comes on and says, don't worry, you guys are just white people. So part of me says, well, hold on a second, I'm not just a white person, I'm a Jew, and that makes me different. But at the same time, I don't want to try to use my my victim card and say, I'm a specially protected class, and therefore you have to, treat me like
Isn't that the immediate response? The backlash on Twitter, I'm not going to name the people who immediately jumped on social media and sort of, read her the riot act, but we do, as a community and as individuals within the community, we do play that card a lot. And you only need to look at the various newspapers that circulate among the community to know that reports of anti-Semitism do dominate our discourse. They dominate our discussions. Some people even make videos about them, for example.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Can't imagine who.
Yeah. I don't really know where to go from there. In other words, like, on the one hand, we have to be very cognizant of the very real threats that are made to our Judaism, but that to me feels like it puts us into a box that I don't necessarily feel comfortable being in, for the same reasons that we discussed at the very beginning. I don't feel comfortable calling myself a race, and I don't feel comfortable calling the Jewish people just a religion. And so as a result, I think the ideal is to live in a society where I don't have to be defined by how outsiders treat me. And that's really what the issue is.
I can say something controversial. I think you're not straying, but you've moved much closer to where Whoopi Goldberg was coming from, in the sense that maybe it's your individual preference. I think there's a lot of wisdom to what you've said, that it's not actually... Her main point was it's not constructive. And again, they're debating, why has this book been removed from circulation in high schools and secondary schools? And her point is, well, it should forget the graphic violence and the nudity and the other content within. It should be removed from high schools, presumably because you're not really studying anything unique. You're just studying white on white inhumanity.
Well,
there's nothing racially unique about the Holocaust, so why have a special book about it?
But when you put it that way, I can't say that I would come out in the camp of Whoopi Goldberg. Because if I don't look at the past and learn from the ways in which people hated Jews back then, and that was probably for what they called racism, then I won't be able to point out today the reasons why people hate Jews today. If we're all just blending into whatever the general issue of the human condition is, then there's never going to be able to be a way to say that actually there is a unique form of hatred that goes against Jews. It just transforms and mutates based on the generation.
Which does make it very difficult to learn about and focus on and solve, because it evolves generation to generation. And yet, in the prelude to the Second World War, Jews were blamed for capitalism. Simultaneously, they were blamed for communism and everything in between. And it was almost like, well, you can't win. It's a lose-lose. Wherever you turn, you're stuck and you're criticized and condemned. So what do you do?
Yeah.
Ironically, maybe Whoopi Goldberg's point leads us to your earlier conclusion, which is the only way to avoid making race the issue is to make it a non-issue and say we are simply looking at the inability of human beings to behave decently to one another. Now, that may be very hard to solve, but I don't think necessarily wanting there to be a solution should dictate to us how we frame the problem.
It's a good point. I would also agree with you that in the conclusion, we may be able to blame Whoopi Goldberg for the fact that she misread history. But right now to say, oh, and as a result, we should emphasize our race today in the 21st century, I don't know if that would be the right answer.
And that is a bit of a paradox, because I don't think any Jewish person, again, the backlash on social media was very clear. If you read Mein Kampf and you listen to the speeches, Hitler made race front and center. He also had plenty of goes at the religious and cultural aspects, but race was what justified the entire policy. The Wannsee Conference was built on this idea they are physically, physiologically different to other races. That was 1920s, 1930s. Nowadays, not a single reasonable-minded person is going to make race in terms of physical characteristics a discussion.
Yeah. Well, one thing I can say is thank you, Whoopi Goldberg, for giving Jews yet another reason to argue with each other.
And thank you, Whoopi Goldberg, for getting us trending on Twitter once again. 0.025% of the population, 30% of the tweets. We're always here.
Good speaking to you, Rabbi.
And you, Rabbi Moshe. Pleasure as always.